For days no one saw the family at the isolated farm. Yet the cattle were still being fed. A pail had been moved. Grain lay scattered in the stalls. Food had disappeared from a plate, while no lamp burned and no voice answered from the house. Who was feeding the animals? Outside, footprints crossed the snow. They came from the trees, passed the barn, and ended at the farmhouse door. There were no matching tracks leading away. An empty house could be abandoned. A locked house could be frightened. But living animals, shifted food, and fresh tracks, stopping at the threshold, suggested that someone had entered, or was still close enough to return. By the time the door was opened, the question was no longer whether the occupants had left. It was who had stayed behind. For several days Hinterkaifeck had vanished from the village routine. The Gruber family did not appear at church. The younger Kezilia did not go to school. Mail gathered at the farmhouse, and newspapers remained unread. In a place where every absence was noticed, the silence became impossible to dismiss. On March 31, 1922, 6 people were believed to be living there. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kezilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, also named Kezilia, her 2-year-old son Joseph, and the newly hired maid Maria Baumgartner. Then the days passed, and no one came down from the farm. Concern hardened into suspicion when neighbors saw that the animals had not been abandoned. Cattle still needed feeding and milking. The farm could not sit empty without someone entering the barns. Reports also placed fresh footprints in the snow near the property, tracks that led toward the buildings but did not clearly lead away. On April 4, Lorenz Schlittenbauer went up to Hinterkaifeck with Jakob Sigel and Michael Pohl. Schlittenbauer knew the family well. He had once been close to Victoria and believed he might be the father of her young son. Now the farmhouse stood shut, with no answer from inside. They searched the outbuildings first. In the barn, beneath a covering of hay, they found 4 bodies: Andreas Gruber, his wife Kezilia, Victoria, and the little girl Kezilia. The hay concealed the dead from anyone approaching the building. At first the men could not even understand what they were seeing. Then they entered the house. In a room inside they found 2 more victims, 2-year-old Joseph and Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived only the day before the killings. 6 people had been attacked. None had escaped to raise an alarm. But the farmhouse did not look like a place abandoned in panic. The animals were alive. Food had been handled. The bodies had been covered, and the household silence had lasted for days while someone, or something, continued moving through the property. This was the Hinterkaifeck murder case. In late March 1922, 6 people were killed at the isolated farm. The victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Kezilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children Kezilia and Joseph, and the newly hired maid Maria Baumgartner. The killings were horrifying. The days that followed were worse. So much of motion. Reports from the farm suggested that someone may have remained behind, feeding the cattle, handling food, and moving through the silent buildings while the bodies lay concealed nearby. Cows needed attention. Hay had to be carried. The stalls had to be cleaned. Any animal left without care might have drawn attention from the road. So the footprints raised one question while the barn raised another. Had an outsider come to the farm and fled into the night? Or had the killer stayed, hidden in plain sight, moving through the buildings after the family was dead? The tracks did not prove that anyone had vanished. Weather, light, and the haste of the first searchers could have distorted what they saw. But inside the farm The signs of continued activity pointed toward something far more disturbing. The killer may not have fled immediately. He may have remained at Hinterkaifeck, keeping the animals alive while the bodies lay hidden only a few steps away. The time window was narrow, but it was real. The murders were believed to have taken place between the evening of March 31st and the early hours of April 1st. The bodies were discovered on April 4th. For roughly 3 days, the property sat apart from the village, surrounded by fields, trees, and muddy tracks. No telephone brought help. No neighbor had a clear view of the yard. Anyone watching from the barn or the forest could see a visitor approaching long before that visitor saw them. Hinterkaifeck was not one sealed building. It was a cluster of connected spaces: the farmhouse, the barn, the machinery rooms, the animal stalls, the hayloft, and the paths between them. Someone familiar with the layout could move from one structure to another without standing in the open for long. The loft offered cover above the stalls. The barn concealed movement behind walls and piled fodder. At night, a few steps across the yard could vanish into darkness. That knowledge may have belonged to someone from the neighborhood. Before the killings, the family had reported strange events. Footsteps in the attic, a newspaper that did not belong to them, and footprints in the snow near the farm. Shiver motion. Andreas Gruber was said to have searched the buildings and found no intruder. Were those warnings connected to the murders? No one could prove it, but they created an unsettling possibility. Someone may have been studying the property before entering it. The killer also seemed to understand the family's routines. The victims were lured, one by one, toward the barn. Whoever struck them there knew where the animals were kept and how the farm operated. Inside the house, food, clothing, tools, and rooms still showed the shape of ordinary life, interrupted, not ransacked, by a stranger searching blindly. Then came the detail that turned the crime from a massacre into a waiting game. The animals were still alive when the farm was discovered. Some appeared to have received care after the murders. That raised a terrifying question. Had the killer left immediately, or had someone remained on the property, while 6 bodies lay hidden nearby? But this is where surviving evidence begins to blur with later storytelling. A cow being fed does not identify who fed it. Milk found in a pail does not prove that the murderer personally milked it after the attack. Some details were recorded by witnesses. Others were repeated in newspaper accounts. Over time, possibilities hardened into facts. The claim that the killer lived in the attic for days is possible. Yet no hidden room was found, and no direct witness saw a man emerge from the loft. The animals may point to a person who stayed behind. They may also reflect incomplete records, routine farm work, or details changed by retelling. The same caution applies to the missing exit trail. Snow can preserve one set of footprints and erase another. A person could leave by a packed path, cross ground disturbed by farm work, or use the buildings to avoid leaving a clean line toward the forest. The absence of tracks is suspicious. It is not a map of an invisible escape. What the clues establish is smaller and colder. The farm was isolated. The offender knew enough to exploit that isolation. The animals survived long enough to suggest post-murder care, and the buildings offered places where a person could wait, watch, and move unseen. But who? The first suspect was not a shadowy stranger. It was someone who had once worked inside the house, a former servant who had left Hinterkaifeck after complaining about footsteps, noises in the attic, and the feeling that someone was moving through the buildings after dark. Her story gave investigators a possible motive. Andreas Gruber was remembered as a difficult employer in a household already marked by conflict. If she had been humiliated or dismissed, she might have known the rooms, the doors, the tools, and the family's habits. But familiarity is not guilt, and that's so much of motion. The servant had left months before the killings, and no confirmed sighting placed her near the farm on the night of March 31st, 1922. Her account explained why the house had acquired a reputation for being haunted. It did not explain 6 bodies, the missing killer, or the care given to the animals afterward. Then attention shifted to the neighbors, people who needed no introduction to the property. They knew which path crossed the fields where the farm buildings stood, and when the Grubers usually came into the yard. A local person could move around Hinterkaifeck without drawing attention. They might also know that visitors were rare and that darkness could hide footsteps on the road. The theory fit the geography. It did not produce a name. Several neighbors had heard Andreas speak about strange signs before the murders. Footprints appeared in the snow, leading from the forest toward the farm, but none seemed to lead away. A newspaper arrived on the property even though no one admitted bringing it. A locked door, a missing key, noises above the ceiling. Each detail suggested someone had been testing the house before the attack. Yet the timing mattered. These reports were gathered after the killings, when every old memory had acquired a darker meaning. A footprint that once seemed strange could now look like a warning. A newspaper could become evidence. A noise in the attic could become the first move in a murder plot. The family's relatives were examined as well. Hinterkaifeck was not a peaceful household. Andreas and his daughter, Victoria, had been surrounded by gossip about an incestuous relationship, while Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had been declared dead after the First World War. Their children, Kezilia and Joseph, belonged to a family structure filled with shame, disputed loyalties, and possible inheritance concerns. The question was no longer just who could enter the farm unseen. It was whether the danger had been waiting outside, or had already been living within the family. One figure drew particular attention. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had been involved with Victoria and believed he might be Joseph's father. He knew the family. He knew the farm. And he had a personal reason to resent Andreas. He was also, among the men who entered the property after the bodies were discovered, a detail that later made his actions look suspicious. But suspicion is not a timeline. Schlittenbauer's presence could be explained by his connection to Victoria and the alarm raised by the abandoned farm. No surviving evidence proved that he killed anyone, hid inside the buildings, or returned to feed the animals. His name supplied motive and local knowledge. It did not supply an escape route. A robbery offered a simpler explanation. Someone might have believed money was hidden at Hinterkaifeck, broken in, and killed the household after being recognized. The farm's isolation made it an attractive target. A killer could have searched the rooms afterward. But little clearly identified property was missing, and robbery alone struggled to explain the waiting, the earlier signs, and the carelessness of leaving so many bodies undiscovered. A personal attack fit the family's private tensions better. A rejected lover, an angry relative, or someone connected to the paternity rumors could have arrived with a grievance that had been growing for years. That person might have known exactly whom to confront first. Yet every version broke at the same point. No weapon, confession, reliable witness, or confirmed departure connected the motive to the crime. The investigators kept finding fragments that almost locked together. A former servant explained the haunting stories. A neighbor explained the knowledge of the farm. A relative explained the anger. A robber explained the violence. None explained all three mysteries at once. How the killer escaped without leaving a usable trail. How he moved through Hinterkaifeck with such confidence, and why his identity vanished after 6 murders. The suspects almost fit. That was the problem. By the time police began working through Hinterkaifeck, the farm was no longer a sealed crime scene. Neighbors had crossed the yard, entered the buildings, and gathered around the dead. Curiosity moved faster than procedure. In a village where everyone knew the Grubers, people came to look, pray, search for relatives, and decide what they thought had happened. The bodies were handled according to the standards of 1922, not those of a modern and homicide investigation. They were examined, photographed in limited ways, and eventually taken away for autopsy. But there was no controlled perimeter, no complete record of every person who stepped inside, no systematic collection of trace material from every room. Mud could be crushed beneath a boot. A footprint could vanish under another footprint. Fibers, fingerprints, and small objects could be touched or moved before anyone recognized their value. Even the farm's layout became a problem. Hinterkaifeck stood apart from the village, with a barn, stable, machine room, and main house connected by dark passages and heavy doors. Investigators had to interpret a place already entered by frightened civilians, relatives, and police officers moving through unfamiliar rooms. A door left open might have been opened by the killer, or by a neighbor. A tool might have been used in the attack, used for farm work, or shifted during the search. The scene offered clues, but no reliable way to tell which hands had disturbed them. Then came the decision to keep the farm operating. The cattle needed food. The other animals needed attention. Someone had to milk, feed, and clean up. Every return to the property created another chance for footprints to disappear and surfaces to be touched. Daily farm work began covering the crime scene one chore at a time. The same animals that might reveal whether someone stayed behind were being tended in a place where evidence was constantly being erased. The investigation also depended heavily on memory. Villagers recalled strange footprints in the snow, newspapers that appeared to have been read, noises near the house, and an unknown man seen in the area. But recollections change when a murder becomes famous. A detail heard from one neighbor can become a certainty in another person's story. A rumor repeated often enough begins to look like independent confirmation, even when every version traces back to the same conversation. That is how a large suspect pool can create the illusion of progress. Each name seems to add another piece: a quarrel, a debt, a prison record, a connection to the farm, a suspicious absence. Investigators can move from one possible culprit to the next and feel the search narrowing. Yet without preserved evidence that can be tested against those people, the list only grows. 6 suspects can produce 6 theories. 60 suspects can create the feeling that the answer must be close, while making it harder to separate fact from speculation. The paperwork carried its own weaknesses. Statements were recorded in the language and categories of the time. Some witnesses were questioned once, others more than once, and later accounts sometimes changed. Reports, photographs, maps, autopsy notes, and local newspaper stories did not always preserve the same level of detail. A missing page or vague description could matter more than a dramatic rumor. It could remove the ability to check what investigators actually knew on a particular day, and whether the person feeding the animals was preserving a clue or destroying one. By 1923, the farm was gone. The rooms where 6 people had been murdered were pulled down, and their belongings, clothing, tools, bedding, household objects, were sold, scattered, or destroyed. The place that might have answered the questions became a memory held together by documents. Modern science can still test what survived. DNA analysis might examine preserved hair, blood traces, clothing, or material caught in old fabric. Digitized Bavarian newspapers and police records could reveal contradictions buried across separate archives. A reconstruction, built from maps, measurements, and witness statements, might show whether a door, window, or line of sight matched the stories told about that night. But DNA cannot be extracted from a coat that was burned. A digital archive cannot restore a fingerprint no one lifted. A computer can rebuild the barn, not the footprints erased by boots and weather. New tools can question surviving evidence. They cannot create the evidence Hinterkaifeck lost in its first days. That loss has a cruel consequence. The most famous clues may be the ones least securely recorded. After the murders, people said the cattle had been fed, the other animals had received care, and signs of ordinary life remained inside the farmhouse. The image seemed to point in one direction. The killer had not fled. Someone had stayed. But who saw the animals first? When had they last been fed? Which details came from police, and which came from neighbors entering the property after the bodies were found? A cow that had not yet starved does not prove that a murderer remained for days. It may only show that the family had cared for it shortly before they died. The same uncertainty surrounds the house. A fire could have been lit before the attack, so much emotion. Food could have been prepared earlier. Doors might have been opened by the victims, the killer, or the villagers who moved through the rooms afterward. Once dozens of people entered the farm, every footprint and disturbed object became part of the confusion. Then there were the tracks in the snow. They seemed to lead from the woods toward Hinterkaifeck, with no clear trail leading away. It was an image almost designed to create a prisoner inside the farm. A stranger arrives, murders. Murders 6 people, and disappears beneath the roof while the snow keeps his secret. But the tracks had no time stamp. They might have been made before the murders. They might have belonged to someone who left by another route. They might not have belonged to the crime at all. That does not make the hidden resident theory impossible. It makes it unfinished. The animals, the footprints, and the signs of activity can fit a killer who stayed behind. They can also fit a shorter timeline, a mistaken observation, or a crime scene altered, before investigators understood what they were seeing. And once the phrase, "the killer fed the animals," entered the story, every later suspect had to pass through it. A neighbor with access, a soldier familiar with the farm, a relative who knew the buildings. The clue became a filter, even though no one had firmly measured its edges. At Hinterkaifeck, ambiguity did not remain empty for long. It hardened into a story, and the story began choosing the suspects. Yet the farm never yielded a name. It yielded traces, animals that had not immediately starved, signs that someone had moved through the buildings, and a silence that felt less like abandonment than interruption. The house seemed to contain more human presence after the murders than investigators could confidently assign to anyone. That is why the case refuses to settle. So much of motion. The killer may have stayed, feeding the cattle and walking beneath the roof while the village searched beyond the gates. Or those signs may have been several ordinary acts, misread and enlarged by fear. The footprints, the open doors, and the missing certainty could point toward a living person, but none could carry a name. By the time the farm was demolished, the rooms had surrendered their bloodstains, their positions, and the small detail that might have separated a terrifying answer from a plausible one. The house was not merely where the murders happened. It was the last witness, and it was destroyed before it could say whether the person who fed the animals was the killer, a victim, or no one at all.